Strategic International Studies. Before we begin our program, I want to share with you some of our building safety precautions. Overall, we feel very secure in our building, but as a convener, we have a duty to prepare you for any eventuality. So, Lisa Collins, you can see right here, Lisa Phillips, will serve as your responsible safety officer at the event. And please follow her instructions should the need arise. Let's take a moment just to familiarize ourselves with our emergency exit pathway in this room. It's right in the back. You can see the big exit right over there. And with that, let's turn to our program. It's my pleasure to welcome you all here, both our distinguished speakers and our guests today to the center. I'd like to recognize the International Crisis Group as our conference co-host here, and we're very grateful to them for their partnership. I'd also like to point you to this screen, The Impossible State. This is a podcast that we've started here at CSIS. It's with Victor Cha and Sumi Terry and Mike Green and a whole host of other people, Rebecca Hirschman, a whole host of other CSIS experts and outside experts who know a lot about North Korea. We do it about every 2 weeks. You can find it on Apple Podcasts, or also known as iTunes, and you can also find it on CSIS's website. So we'd love to hear your feedback on it. Please listen and give us a review if you can. Without further ado, I'd like to introduce my boss, John Hamre, the CSIS CEO and President, who's going to get us started today. Thank you very much.
Good afternoon, everybody. Welcome. We're delighted to have you here. I think it was 23 years ago when I was in government, and I remember Madeleine Albright coming back to say, we've stopped the North Korean program in its tracks. Boy, what a, she gets excoriated in Congress for that. And it's just as a reminder, we've had numerous episodes where we've been hopeful but disappointed with the trajectory we've tried to take with North Korea. So I must confess, I begin this program today, and I begin the whole thing with a healthy dose of skepticism about what we really do have. And I think the longer it goes, the more confirmed I am in my skepticism, sadly. But I don't think we should. We shouldn't start with the premise that this isn't a desirable outcome that would be made to happen. Obviously, Northeast Asia and the world would be safer if North Korea were to eliminate its nuclear weapons. I don't think there's any question about that. The question is, how do we know? How would we be certain that we are living in that world? You can't take, design ideas out of the brains of an engineer. You can't take the knowledge out of scientists. So there's always that latent question about, have we really come up with an acceptable outcome for a very serious problem? So we do have a good starting point, and frankly, that is the agreement that we reached, the Obama administration yesterday reached with Iran. That was a fairly comprehensive verification. Significant detail, a good starting point baseline of what was involved with the nuclear complex in Iran. We had much more certainty about the nuclear complex in Iran because they continued to comply with the IAEA inspections, whereas North Koreans booted IAEA out. And of course, that means we're going to be dependent on, a declaratory starting point that we don't have right now. And recent intelligence is indicating that even new things are being built. They blow up, something that's inoperable, but they discover there are whole facilities you never knew about. I mean, the starting point obviously has to be the declaration, and then there's going to have to be the right to challenge inspections. It's going to be a very beefy regime if we're going to find it acceptable. Could we find anything less than that acceptable? No, not when it comes to nuclear weapons. I mean, the threat of nuclear weapons to North Korea's neighbors and to us is of such enormous consequence. We cannot get soft on this question of verification of a disarmament regime. We're going to explore that today. And I'm very grateful that the International Crisis Group is here with us today. Thank you for taking the time to be with us and to co-sponsor this. We've got two excellent programs. We're going to dig in considerable depth this afternoon, and I'm glad all of you are here. So I think we should get started, and I believe, Steve, you're going to take it over, right?
Yeah, I guess so.
Why don't you come on up and have the panelists come up? Thank you all for coming. Thanks to our panelists for leading this conversation.
Thanks so much. Very nice. Thanks. Thank you. I'll do the
I
dance
should
here.
have gone third.
Doesn't matter, I think. So I'm going to try and speak from the seated position, and if there's difficulty hearing me, please wave or something so that I know. Okay, so this may work. So my name's Steve Pomper. I'm from the International Crisis Group, and let me reciprocate Dr. Hamry's kind words by saying, well, first of all, thank you to all of you for joining us today, and thanks to our co-hosts here at CSIS for the great partnership in pulling this event together, and thanks especially to our fantastic panelists, who I'll introduce shortly. We could really hardly have a more informed group to take us into today's discussion. As Dr. Hamry alluded to, we do have a two-part program today that's going to be looking in the first instance at the practical elements of denuclearization, and then in the second.
Libya made the much ballyhooed strategic choice, and yes, the 2003 agreement led to a rapid dismantlement and removal effort. But let's be real, it was of production and equipment and facilities that weren't even operational. No weapons and no weapons usable material were removed. There was little prospect of doing so. They weren't in any ready to even have those capabilities in place. So yes, it was fast, but you have to ask yourself, of what? What about the one program that Libya had in which they had actual weapons and materials, their chemical weapons program? That took 13 years to complete. The final and removal and destruction of Libya's Schedule II chemicals did not happen until 2016. Complete destruction of its chemical munitions and unitary agent only in 2014. So for those who describe the Libya model as something relevant to the current DPRK situation, they seem to vastly underestimate the comparative difference in two things, both in the scale and advancement of the two programs, which frankly are completely incomparable. If Libya offers a sense of timescale, then you're well into the multi-decade or century-long process of elimination, simply using that so-called fast case. But just as importantly, in terms of overestimating the ability to secure strategic choice through coercive pressure. Because there's really nothing much about, and I would argue in the Libya story, that in fact suggests that that progress was made through heavy coercive pressure, at least not specifically on that program. Syria, on the other hand, is the one that received a lot of coercive pressure and faced threat of military action. And in doing so, led to negotiations about the Syrian chemical weapons program. It joined the CWC, and through an international effort, began the elimination of its chemical weapons program in 2013. The international effort to remove and destroy Syria's chemical weapons dramatically reduced their chemical weapons program and the risks associated with it. It did remove and destroy the vast majority of the program in less than 1 year. But no such effort can eliminate the expertise and capabilities to reconstitute on a small scale, or the covert production, or to ability to restore covert production, or discourage a regime from using a capability in which they find strategic value, as was the case in Syria. The international community's mistake was not in actually removing the capabilities that it could, but in what I would argue was a naive embrace of Syria's rhetoric and the gross miscalculation of the international community in terms of Syria's sincerity in foregoing a capability that it valued. And I would argue, admittedly, this was a chemical weapons case, but I would argue this Syria example, along with North Korea's own history, really should be our cautionary tale today. So I would argue, unless and until North Korea comes to the conclusion for itself that possessing nuclear weapons is more dangerous to its security than eliminating them, this fundamental reassessment of their strategic value of these weapons, the best we can hope for is risk reduction. I simply don't believe North Korea has made that choice. So what does risk reduction look like? It's a more limited aim, but let's face it, when we're talking about the threat of nuclear-tipped long-range missiles that can threaten the U.S. homeland, as well as the territories of our allies, risk reduction is a worthy goal nonetheless, and we can focus on that. And we can focus on it in a step-by-step way as we approach negotiations. In that sense, I think we may find some agreement across the panel. But we've got to be pragmatic in that process. So if the opportunity exists to reduce the risks, open perhaps by a changing political environment or perceptions of opportunities that exist, we should take it, but we need to do it with eyes wide open and in ways that are measurable and meaningful and that can be done quickly. Now we got some big structural challenges. First, the basic structure of the negotiations. We really don't even know what that structure is, and we don't know enough about what's included. Let me just say, I don't have a problem with the top-down approach being tried here and attempting a summit up front. The old ways didn't work, so it's worth a try. I understand the technique to give it a sense of imperative and buy-in, even though it did amount to an early concession. That was a risk that was perhaps worth taking. But the details are so light. The challenge here is that not just even that the details are missing, but the big picture is almost impossible to see as well. So the summit was long on body language and symbolism, short on details, and we've got some major structural problems or blanks that have got to be filled in. Scope, participation, timeline. What's being negotiated? Does it include chem bio? Is it only nuclear? How do we talk about the missiles? Will they be left with a residual capability for nuclear civilian energy or not? How will that be divided? How will it be monitored? Will this be distinct from a peace treaty? Will it be an independently negotiated outcome, or will it be a subordinate to that? Will it be done in sequential steps or simultaneously? What's the role for South Korea, Japan, Russia, or China? Is it a bilateral, a multilateral agreement? My goodness, how will the IAEA be involved, if at all? There are so many questions in more than a month coming out of Singapore. We don't know those basics. The basics that include questions like who's in the room, who's in the negotiation, what are we even talking about? That's a problem. Now, there's also a struggle that we don't understand even the basic negotiating framework. Are we negotiating a comprehensive agreement? And generally, when we negotiate comprehensive arms control agreements, we are looking at a situation where you're trying to say nothing's really done, nothing's finally agreed till everything's agreed, because you got to manage the allocation of your carrots and sticks. We also sometimes consider step by step, and clearly many have argued, and I think that the report argues in favor of a more step-by-step approach to help lay the groundwork for future things, to allow things to be done more quickly, and to build confidence. That can work, but we have to, again, understand what are our long-term objectives, what are we trying to do, and how do we make sure we're not just giving things away without getting something in return. So what are those risk reduction mechanisms and techniques that we could apply that would help get us there? One of the challenges is the administration and the president don't seem to be on the same page. And that I'm struggling to kind of thread that needle. The president seems much more transactional, much more focused on step by step, but the rhetoric coming more formally seems to be focused on a more comprehensive agreement. So there also just seems to be a lot of quid on the table from the US and not a lot of clarity about what kind of quo is coming back our way. So we've got to figure that out. I'll note that you could do a hybrid agreement. I do think you can do a mixture of step-by-step and a comprehensive approach, but the trick is you've really got to sort out your carrots. The sticks are hard enough. What are you going to do then? But what are we prepared to give? When do we want to give it? The current uncertainty and confusion right now suggests we might be looking at the worst of both worlds. No meaningful risk reduction benefits as a result of early concessions, while frittering away negotiating leverage. Just a couple of other things. The technical challenges. I feel the need to make this, we'll get into this, more as we go. It is impossible to overstate the size and magnitude of this program, especially if you choose to incorporate, as one probably should in a comprehensive agreement, those chemical and biological weapons capabilities as well. It is massive. It is scores beyond any other comprehensive, other arrangement that's been done with any other country. We've got to get our technical advisors, our operational advisors, and we've got to start putting those details in the hands of the experts. It's got to get out of the stratosphere and down to some brass tacks, and that's got to happen right away. What's the worst thing that can happen from this sort of technical perspective if that isn't done? I would argue that under pressure for a win or an ability to declare victory at the political level, some may be tempted to shrink the problem to fit the time available or to portray concessions as far more impactful than they really are. And that is just plain dangerous. Third, the political challenge, and I really don't think this can be underestimated. Any negotiation is going to take time. Any verification regime will take time and effort to put in place. To suggest it can be done incredibly quickly, in my view, is simply naive. So it's not, I don't think, going to be completed in a single administration. Bipartisanship will be needed to maintain this for the longevity. However, it is not clear we will have what we need in terms of bipartisanship. The reality is that the turning away from the Iran deal, which was, as Dr. Hamre said, a comprehensive and verifiable deal, at least from a risk reduction perspective, it will be very challenging to replicate, but it has sowed such a toxic atmosphere politically that I think it'll be very, very difficult to move forward. We're already seeing some of those tensions coming from Capitol Hill in terms of letters, bipartisan approaches, others putting incredibly high demands on the negotiators and on the expectations for verification. The JCPOA's creation and dismantlement will hang over every step of this going forward, and it will be very difficult to get out from under its burden. So what do we do go forward? 3 quick things. I think we need to focus upfront on these quick risk reduction elements. They're not really quick, but they're a lot quicker than getting the whole thing done. Real capability reductions, I think we need to focus on material production, weapons usable material, and material accounting. We can come back in the Q&A and talk about weapons. Yes, it would be nice to focus on weapons. I just think it's probably too hard. But frankly, similarly, I think focusing on testing is just day late, dollar short. I don't think there's any utility in talking about, blowing up a facility that was already largely defunct. And as a reminder, North Korea has now done a comparable number of tests to India and Pakistan in terms of total numbers of tests. They don't really need to test anymore. So it's taking away something that doesn't mean very much. Transparency, monitoring, and inspection. Those are things also we can get on the, going right away if we have agreement. I think if they're serious, if you want to see a goodwill gesture, declare a uranium enrichment facility, get an inspector right away. It's a phone call and a plane ride. I'll be happy. That'll look like meaningful progress to me, far more than some of the other things we've been talking about. The third one, though, goes back to this big picture. We need to step back and constantly, even now, remember, even as this is going on, we have to deter North Korea. We have to have a credible deterrence relationship with North Korea. And we need to continually influence DPRK perceptions as to the value, risks, and efficacy of nuclear weapons, and try to convince them that, in fact, that a longer-term strategic turn away from nuclear weapons is in their actual interest. Now, North Korea has a lot of things they'll want in return: regional security, a path to economic viability, normalization inside the international community. We need to prioritize our carrots and have a much clearer sense of which of these belong in the step-by-step confidence-building bucket and which have to be held for the longer-term comprehensive deal. some of those things will have to be held back. And I would argue that any steps that weaken our alliances in the region or enhance DPRK's relative military and strategic posture, such as U.S. forces on the peninsula or the fundamental alliance that we have with the DPRK, should certainly be in the latter long-term category, if at all, and not in the current carrots and sticks. But I think if we do that, if we focus on that, some of these steps can actually reduce immediate risks and create an environment in which we might be able to continue to make progress.
Thanks very much. That was a terrific way to lead us off. Richard, will you pick up the torch?
No, thanks very much, Steve, and thank you to CSIS and to ICG for hosting this event. And it's great to be on a panel with former colleagues and bosses, so which is both great and intimidating all at the same time. I worked on the Korea desk at the State Department for a number of years, and one of the jokes we used to have there is that, much like action movies, North Korea, the rule is the sequel is never as good as the original. Now, that might not be the case for the Fast and Furious movies. I'll posit that. But basically, it's interesting that we're having the same debates and the same discussions today that we were having during the Great Framework period, certainly the period of the six-party talks, the Leap Day deal, and all the way up until now. Now, that may be a sign that we have not learned our lessons very well. Or it might be a sign that we did learn our lessons, but that even in the best case scenario, as Rebecca outlined really comprehensively, this is not going to be a walk in the park. So what I thought I would do is just go into a little bit more of sort of the logistical and pragmatic elements of a possible denuclearization deal, and a couple of key principles or takeaways, and then obviously in the Q&A we can get into some of these other more interesting details. And some of this will overlap with what Rebecca said, because I agree with a lot of what she said. I think the first thing to think about is the importance of sequencing. I think that these are all things we have to think about at the outset. One of the mistakes that we made, I think, in some of the previous cases, including the six-party talks, which I was engaged in, was trying to get going early to build momentum, to try and get something going, fight against internal political opposition, and then we would sort of deal with the details later. I think it's better to start, even if it's harder to do, with some of these details up front. In my mind, a very basic sequence goes like this. First, we have to define the current freeze. I think it's remarkable that we don't actually have on a piece of paper what is frozen. What missile tests are not taking place? No nuclear tests. Okay, well, as we've seen in previous cases, and I'll come back to this, that could be a recipe for disaster. So we need to define this freeze, and then we need to figure out the monitoring mechanisms for making sure that it freeze is being upheld. We don't have inspectors on the ground right now in Yongbyon. We don't have inspectors at the test sites. We have no idea. We know through national technical means, but we don't have a real good monitoring mechanism yet. Next, I think we need a declaration. And I know immediately when I say the word declaration, they're going to say, but it's going to be incomplete, it's going to be incorrect, the North Koreans are going to lie about their program. That's true. I'm okay with getting a declaration that's incorrect and incomplete if it's the start of a process. And particularly what I have in my mind is the way that the International Atomic Energy Agency works, their process of verification is iterative. The IAEA does not assume that even the most cooperative country in the world is going to provide a complete and correct declaration at the outset. There's going to be mistakes. Some country's going to forget they have a radioactive source in a hospital somewhere. It's a process, and you should work through it. We need to, Rebecca talked about this, we need to lay out the scope of this dismantlement, this denuclearization. What's covered? Are we talking just the nuclear program? Are we talking about just materials, fuel cycle facilities? What about the missiles? What about chem and bio? And as Rebecca said, that makes it an even bigger process, but we need to know at the outset, what are we talking about here? And then a key point, and I'd say this not only because my title has this word in it, but verification is essential. And we need to set up verification mechanisms early on. I have a very strong preference for the involvement of the IAEA, at least in the fuel cycle process. When it gets into weapons, it might get a little bit more difficult, but I think even there could be a role for the agency. And there will be hybrid arrangements for other parts of the program, whether it's missiles, where our DoD has a lot of experience working with the Russians on this, and in chem bio, there's obviously other elements, including the OPCW. But we have to talk about this at the outset. My second takeaway is, and this might seem really obvious, but we need to leave the negotiating table with the same understanding, and we should get it in writing. We have multiple cases where The United States and North Korea got together, they thought that they had a deal, and they walked away, and it became very clear that they didn't have the same understanding. Some of this may have been true miscommunication, some of it may have been obfuscation on the part of the North Koreans, but they needed to have the same understanding. Two quick examples. In 2008, some of us were involved in trying to negotiate a verification protocol with the DPRK. The Bush administration even came out and released, you can find it online, a set of verification principles of how this regime would work. Within about a month, Pyongyang came out and said, we're not doing that. We didn't agree to take environmental samples. We don't want this level of intrusiveness. And that was kind of the beginning of the end for the six-party talks. The better example might be the 2012 Leap Day deal, where, as most of you probably know, the ink was barely dry and the deal broke down because the North Koreans launched a satellite. And we, the United States, I think correctly said this was a violation of the UN Security Council resolutions, and it ran counter to the deal, which said there would be no missile launches. Now, I was in the room. The North Koreans never said they would not launch a space launch vehicle. They said that they would like to launch a space launch vehicle. Our side said, we don't think you should do that. That would be a violation of this deal. And the North Koreans said, we understand that's your position. But they did it anyway. So we didn't have a definition in the deal about what happens with space launches. They also released two different versions of the statement. Compare the US statement to the North Korean statement. The North Korean statement doesn't talk about the Yongbyon reactor. It doesn't talk about plutonium production. So I fear that we're sort of repeating these same mistakes. The key lesson to me is definitions matter. They need to be as clear as possible. Now, in diplomacy, this is a challenge because oftentimes pragmatic ambiguity is your friend. But I do believe that getting answers to these key questions about what is the definition of denuclearization, what happens about space, the space program, what is the scope of facilities, I'd rather deal with these hard issues at the outset than set ourselves up for failure. And as I said, I'm concerned we don't even have a definition of this current freeze. And in my mind, we're one space launch away from another Leap Day crisis. We need to be really clear on verification at the start. And here, again, I don't think we should have to try and reinvent the wheel. There will be differences. And as Rebecca said, the program is much more extensive than even in the case of Iran. But in terms of at least the fuel cycle, I think the IAEA is best placed to do this work. They've been doing this work for decades, and they have a really strong record of doing this well. I would love to see North Korea sign the additional protocol, put forward a declaration, and we start to work through these processes. Now, I recognize that if there's one entity that the DPRK dislikes more than the United States, it's the IAEA. So this is going to be a challenge, but I think it's one worth pressing for. And as I said, other steps like warheads and missiles might require different procedures, but they need to be worked out as well. I think the six-party talks ultimately made a mistake by delaying this discussion, and so we need to make sure that we do that early on. Picking up on one of Rebecca's points, this is going to take time. I think any notion that this is going to get done in less than a year is really unrealistic. The program is too complex, and the amount of mistrust between the parties is just so great that no level of that speed is possible. Now, that said, I think negotiators have to have priorities, and Rebecca talked about things that can be done early on. In the Iran deal, we focused on getting fissile material out quickly and on dismantling plutonium production facilities. The JCPOA didn't provide any sanctions relief until Iran removed 25,000 pounds of low-enriched uranium. They had to dismantle a reactor that would have made plutonium, and many, many more things. But these were the really key things that had to occur. In my view, I think the priority in North Korea has to be the fissile material, which, to be honest, is probably already in weapons form, which does create that challenge. But I think removing HEU and plutonium is key. I also think that if it's a missile deal as well, that we should get at delivery vehicles sooner than later. And you can start at the ICBM range and then work your way down, depending upon how many limits are put in place. Production facilities can take a little bit more time, in my view, as long as your freeze is in place and it's being monitored. But that's kind of the immediate next one on my list, because we don't want any further production of material or vehicles. Rebecca spoke to this a bit too, but you have to decide at the outset, when are benefits going to be provided? Is it action for action, as in the six-party talks? Or is it like in the JCPOA, whereby you have a whole set of actions that have to occur before any sort of relief is provided? In the six-party case, we did action for action, and this led to some problems in that heavy fuel oil shipments were being delayed for some reasons totally out of our control. And the North Koreans complained that they were moving faster than we were, and they decided to hold up on disablement. I think a hybrid approach is possible here, but you have to really think through these possible pitfalls. My last point here is, I think any long-term deal, you have to think about the sustainability of this process. And in my view, and not just my view, but my boss's view, this has to be a cooperative approach. And on April the 23rd, our co-chair at NTI, former Senator Sam Nunn, along with our board member and also former Senator Richard Lugar, did an op-ed in the Washington Post that talked about the idea that cooperative threat reduction, a concept that was used in the former Soviet Union, might be adaptable for North Korea. Obviously, the cases are different and the circumstances would require changes, but the concept here is that if you want to have a long-term buy-in that can both facilitate these negotiations and the implementation of denuclearization, and also give you some greater confidence, I would say risk reduction, in making sure that North Korea does not revert to making fissile material or missiles, you have to get them engaged in doing something else. And so do you allow Iran, Freudian slip. Do you allow North Korea to have a nuclear program of a civil nature? Maybe you do with strict limits. Do you move these scientists and technicians into other fields that are useful for their industrial purposes? I think that there is a cooperative approach that's available, and I like the framework that Steve put out is, with all of the great skepticism we have about this process, and I am certainly a skeptic, I think we have to think, at least in a positive sense, of what could be achievable. And if you get some sort of a CTR type program for North Korea that involves regional players and the North Koreans, this might be something that can help facilitate these more difficult decisions that have to be made in the negotiations. So I think I'll leave it at there and look forward to the discussion, and thanks again for having me here.
Thanks, great. Will, over to you.
Well, thank you, and it's a great pleasure to be back at CSIS. I should say at the outset that I share the skepticism that I think has been evoked by or mentioned by every speaker so far. But I've been asked to speak about North Korean verification of North Korean denuclearization, so that I will do. I thought I would speak a little bit about the context and the methodology of verification, and I've brought some slides, which I hope will, yes. So most of this is familiar to you all, but it's worth bearing in mind that there is some context to this problem, that we've seen decades of US DPRK hostility. In fact, a state of war continues to exist, tempered only by an armistice. North Korea is the most isolated and secretive nation on earth. Kim Jong-un is a brutal totalitarian who can threaten people who work for him. He's already killed one of his uncles and a stepbrother, or a half-brother rather. There is a massive denial and deception campaign within North Korea. And then finally, and most important, North Korea has violated a whole series of agreements that have related to its nuclear program, starting with the NPT and ending with the Leap Day Agreement. And that context simply cannot be ignored as we work out verification. There are, I believe, some imperatives that negotiators should go into the discussions with. The first is to demand a strategic decision. Now, some might say that's simply impossible, but without it, it's very likely that we won't get to where we want to get. We've done this before. The North agreed in the North-South Denuclearization Agreement, in the agreed framework, to abandon all paths toward nuclear weapon. And in fact, they gave up one of those paths and continued to pursue uranium enrichment. I would say, though, that we should understand that such a strategic decision may be reached incrementally. People have talked about the Libya analogy, and the supposition is that because it was announced in December of 2003 and much of the removal activity occurred in January of 2004, culminating in March of 2004, the assumption was that this all went pretty quickly and smoothly. In fact, I believe it was an incremental decision by Gaddafi over a period of months that took convincing. And it was a combination of diplomacy and use of intelligence and, to a certain extent, threats that brought him to the realization that I think Rebecca mentioned, that nuclear weapons were in fact more dangerous to his security than beneficial to his security. And I would agree that until the North reaches that point, it's very unlikely that we will make real progress on this issue. Once a strategic decision has been reached, though, I believe it's important to move quickly before there can be any reconsideration or pushback by people within the country. So we should be prepared to act if, in fact, we do get to that point. And then finally, along the lines of, I think, what's already been mentioned, I would agree we should prioritize our activities and do those things that remove the greatest danger first, particularly weapons and fissile material. So how does one go about verification? The first and most important step is a complete and correct declaration. Will the North submit such a declaration? Well, the precedent and our experience is they will not. Now, if it's incorrect because of error, that's one thing. If it's incorrect because they are attempting to deceive, that's quite another. In either case, though, the methodology is to use access to facilities, equipment, material, people, and records, including sampling, to try and verify what is claimed within the declaration. And the important point is to look for inconsistencies and gaps in the declaration. A declaration can also be verified through external means, including access to information about procurement activities and national intelligence means. The key information to be verified would be weapons production, fissile material production, key weapons components. One example of those might be a neutron generator, but there are lots of other examples. Testing, production, storage, and deployment facilities, testing and production equipment, weapons designs, and delivery vehicles. I'll leave aside for the moment the chem and bio problems, which has already been stated would make the problem much larger. That brings me to what verification is and what it is not. Verification is a process to verify, the completeness and correctness of a declaration by identifying and resolving inconsistencies and lacunae. It's analogous to building a mosaic, where if there are either missing or incorrect tiles, it should be obvious to all and would provide the means to go back and resolve those inconsistencies. Importantly, verification is not a process of using on-site inspections to more or less randomly run around the country looking for illicit activities or some form of intelligence hunt. It's a methodology that should be used with some consistency and a careful process. If I were going to offer a critique of what I would say and what I've said so far, I'd offer two perhaps inconsistent critical judgments. One is, well, you've told us nothing. Of course they have to submit a declaration. Well, that is the key, that is the bedrock of the logic of safeguards agreements and the IAEA's work. But unfortunately, it is not how we have behaved in at least two key cases. The agreed framework was reached in a process that deeply undermined the IAEA's requests to undertake sampling and to gain other information within North Korea. The judgment was made at the time that it was resolve the inconsistencies and the denial and deception programs that the North has already employed. We can't be certain of verification. The other critique that I might have to deal with such an analysis of verification is, well, you've asked for too much. There's no way that the North is going to go along with this. And frankly, I would admit that that's highly likely. I think it's unlikely that the North is going to give up its nuclear weapons, period, let alone submit to an effective verification process. But I would say only that given the fundamental importance of this problem to international security, we can't afford a situation in which the North pretends to denuclearize and we pretend to believe them.
Okay, thank you everybody for those terrific presentations. I think what I'm going to do is start things off by asking each of you a question that draws from what you just spoke about. Then I have a few general questions for the group, and then we can open it up to the audience for their questions. So Rebecca, if it's okay, I'll start with you. Certainly in the run-up to the summit, the rhetoric about denuclearization focused on the phrase complete, verifiable, irreversible denuclearization. And you started to hear from the expert community that at least one of those terms, irreversible, just was magical thinking. You can't make something irreversible for the reasons that Dr. Hamre alluded to and that you spoke to. So the I in CVID dropped out. I thought I heard you dropping a few other letters out too in your presentation. So I wasn't sure whether or not we were really in the realm of either complete or denuclearization anymore after that, and verification was still in there. So if that's the idea, to sort of shift the frame from CVID to something that looks like a more achievable set of goals, risk reduction, what does success look like in the realm of risk reduction? We know what CVID looks like because it's so absolute, but what does success in risk reduction look like?
So I think, and you're right, complete. This goes back to a declaration, right? What is complete? And again, if you can't sort of take it out of their heads, if you can't remove intent, you can't do it, you're just complete is sort of right up there with irreversible. That doesn't mean you don't want as much as you can. And at a minimum, we want to know that what we think we have, we actually have. That's kind of the most, for me, that's the most important thing, is not ending up exactly where Will said, where we think we have something, but in fact it's something entirely different, and we're on completely different pages about something as important as a nuclear armed state that's prepared to potentially attack the United States and its allies, right? So what does risk reduction mean? To me, risk reduction says, as we try to figure out how complete can we be, how verifiable can we be, how realistic is this negotiation, what can we do today to make us safer tomorrow? And I think that speaks to particular actions that can be taken to test the seriousness of the process and whether it's worth the time and effort going forward. For me, that's what risk reduction says. That says if we're going to say, all right, where do we start to actually reduce the threat posed to the United States and its allies? Is it with, I think if you remove fissile material, that is a risk reduction, right? You just can't, if you can even account for fissile material, that is a risk reduction because we start to be able to cap what's there. Do I want the weapons first? Yes. But I think meaningful steps that start to take things off the table is what you'd want to see. Then what do? You practice verification on that. You practice negotiating on that. You practice declaring on that while you lay the groundwork that says, okay, how did that work? What do we do next? That can be done independently, or it can be done at the same time as a broader negotiation, again, in that hybrid idea.
Thank you very much. Richard or Will, did you want to jump in on that in any way?
I agree, and I think that the concept of iteration here is really important. And again, it might be a dirty word in Washington, but I keep coming back to those 5 letters, JCPOA, and I know Will and I have a few differences of opinion on that.
It's
but
not an actual word. Those are 5 letters.
I've heard people try to make it into a word, but it's not a pretty sounding word. But I do think that, again, the process by which the IAEA was undertaking, and frankly still is undertaking in the JCPOA, is a good one, in which that they were going after the things that we did know and making sure that those things had been ended, accounted for, things had been moved, questions had been answered, and then they, at the same time, were beginning to take out the things that we didn't know about. We talked about PMD, for example. I think that that is a process that could work in North Korea as well, and I do think that having an early win, getting some material out of the country, getting an understanding about their programs is a good, important step. But we should also have the framework at the outset that would lead us to a fuller understanding of their program. What I wouldn't want to see is sort of a very interim step of, okay, well, we'll take care of this site, we'll take care of this facility, and we'll talk about the weapons later. I don't think you can completely do that.
Great, thank you very much. So Richard, let me turn to you next with a question about the conversation that you started on the freeze that's currently in place and how little clarity there is about what it specifically covers.
Yeah.
And you alluded to the possibility that we could be one space launch away from a pretty escalatory situation. I wondered about that because, my sort of instinctive way of defining this freeze would be that it would cover a space launch, but that it wouldn't cover necessarily, or might not cover, a short range, liquid fuel launch or something like that. And then I realized, well, that's your point, that we don't know what's covered. Could you give a sort of intuitive sense of where you think the US government's red lines likely are there, and where Pyongyang probably thinks its own lines are?
That's a tough question to answer. I think some of it may just depend upon the mood of the day. I seem to recall in previous cases when I was in government that there were internal discussions about, do we care so much about a Scud launch than we do about a Musudan or an ICBM? It's hard for me to speculate if a launch were to happen today of something very short range, whether or not there would be a view that this was a violation. Frankly speaking, I think the administration is a bit in a box because they've talked so much about missile launches or missile freezes that, again, I don't know what that is a reference to. So they could launch off something that's pretty innocuous and probably an old system that we really don't care as much about, but that would potentially violate this and create a crisis. And again, certainly on the space launch piece, I've never yet heard a North Korean admit that a space launch is essentially the same as an ICBM launch. And even when the UN Security Council resolution in later iterations made very clear that the definition of long-range ballistic missile included a space launch, they didn't agree to that. And so this is where I think this is a judgment more of the political mood versus more of a technical argument. Lots of people argue that in the case of the 2012 deal, that the North Koreans had already scheduled a space launch. And in fact, recall that between the time that the Leap Day discussions began and were completed, Kim Jong-il died. And Kim Jong-un came into place, but was in the mourning period and perhaps wasn't as fully engaged. I will refer to my regional experts for more clarity on that. But there were some theories, and I think that they were pretty good theories, that the North Koreans themselves were boxed and that they put on the calendar, we're launching the space launch vehicle. And even if they agreed with the United States that this was a violation, they felt that they need to carry it out. So I continue to be of the view that until we at least write down something, that this is the freeze, and even better, this is how you monitor that freeze, anything could go. And this entire little break we've had is out the window.
I'd just like to chime in on this because I really think that this hyper-focus on the testing is really problematic. It really sets us up for failure in a couple of ways. Okay, so we know if the North Koreans test either missiles or God forbid, a nuclear weapon tomorrow, we know that's bad. We don't really know that the absence of testing is good. We don't know that it actually means anything. We don't know if it's just part of the testing cycle. They always have a testing cycle. They always take these long breaks. They always come in bursts. We're in the break period. You know, we don't know that there'll be the next crisis that sort of engineers. And I think it's interesting that you raised the, you know, the space launch thing when that was sort of in their test cycle, and that was more problematic for them. So we really don't know. I think we can say testing's bad, but I also think a testing moratorium in either case means nothing. And what we should do is focus on what are other areas where we can get freeze.
And I'll go to Will in 1 second, but just to follow up, do we even know that they've stopped, for example, static testing or other forms of testing that might be below the radar, literally?
I put nothing past them.
Right.
I don't have specific information on that.
Will, go ahead.
There's obviously great uncertainty about what's covered by the freeze, but there's no uncertainty about what is omitted by the freeze. And that is production of fissile material,
Right.
which I believe is the driver of the threat. It drives the threat in 5 key ways. First, it makes for a more aggressive force structure doctrine and posture by the North. Second, it has enabled testing, which has given us improved weapons and delivery vehicle design. Third, it actually may increase the likelihood of sales of fissile material to other states. Fourth, it increases the risk of an accidental or unauthorized launch. And fifth, it increases the danger of theft. And that is going on unabated. They're churning out enough fissile material for perhaps a half a dozen weapons a year, and nothing has stopped that.
We've got violent agreement. I think. I mean, that, you know, how distracting is the testing? But I think we all agree, you know, when do we know this is serious? When we can look at the fissile material production.
Right. So, okay, so Will, the question I have targeted for you is, so we heard from Rebecca what sounded like advocacy for a slightly more pragmatic approach to this. I don't want to put words in your mouth, Rebecca, but it's a little bit of, let's take what we can get, let's test what kind of knowledge we can get from this exercise. Let's not kid ourselves about what we're learning along the way. Will, what I heard from you was it's very important to stay with these very formal mechanisms and the usual choreography, if nothing else for demonstration effect. Do you think that that is the highest purpose of this diplomatic moment that the United States finds itself in with North Korea right now, or could there be other objectives?
Well, I would say we've tried interim steps for a very long time, and we haven't gotten very far. The North Korean nuclear weapons program has made tremendous progress. They now perhaps can threaten the continental United States. Their stocks of fissile material, as I just mentioned, are growing. They've grown to the point where there are all kinds of new threats that are emerging. I think if we're going to get serious about this problem, we're going to have to insist on high standards. Now, if it is impossible to reach those standards, my default policy would be one of containment and deterrence, not the bloody nose. But I think that we need to keep our eye on the ball and insist on real denuclearization.
Great. I'm going to ask just a couple more questions and then we'll turn this over to the group. There was a period of time right in the run-up to the summit where you saw little rumors circulating in the press that the United States was trying to persuade Pyongyang to transfer a handful of nuclear weapons into some third party's hands as a goodwill gesture or a down payment, on some sort of broader agreement. The experts that I've talked to have, cast some doubt on whether or not that would be a particularly good idea. But I wonder if each of you could address whether you think that kind of gesture would have been helpful, or it's something that negotiators should focus on now.
I'll touch on it. I think first of all, look, if presented with the situation or the opportunity to take possession of an adversary's nuclear weapons, we will find a way to do it. And we have, I think, the abilities to do that, but that does not mean there aren't a lot of complications with handling foreign nuclear weapons, that isn't a complicated endeavor. And what my bigger concern at this moment in time would be, what kind of rat hole are we getting drugged down that never actually produces a weapon for us to take possession of, is my more immediate concern. So if that opportunity presents itself, I am confident we can find a way to handle it appropriately rather than kind of turn away from it. that doesn't mean it's an easy prospect.
Yeah, I agree with that. And I would say, as much as I would like to see that sort of thing happen, I think it's a little bit naive to sort of throw that out there.
Yeah.
I agree that the history of the US government is if we can find a way to make it happen, we will. And we have people who know this stuff very well. But I would really rather not us try to fly out or drive out or put on a boat North Korean nuclear weapons and try to deal with them outside of the country. I think that the history of taking apart nuclear warheads in the Soviet Union and other places is, again, you have to have some cooperative element to them. These, just from a safety perspective alone, these are North Korean designs. They may be adapted from other designs, but they are not US designs. Not to say that our experts couldn't probably figure them out, but if I were a true weaponeer, I probably wouldn't want to put my hands on to a North Korean warhead without knowing what the heck it was. So I would say from merely a safety and security perspective, the idea of sort of this down payment, I think, was always kind of silly. Now, that having been said, if we could get a hand on particularly the fissile material in those warheads as a down payment, I'd be open to it as a sign of good faith. But I agree with Rebecca that if that becomes the only thing that we get, and we're not actually getting our minds around the entirety of the program, then it's become kind of a distraction. But I personally wouldn't spend a lot of time on this idea. I would go back to the concept of let's figure out what their production was, where their materials are, and figure out how to get rid of that stuff.
3 weapons as a means to forget 57 doesn't seem like a good deal to me, and that's part of my concern.
A gesture, not a policy.
Okay. So let's assume a best case scenario. I'm taking us out of the realm of just thinking in a sort of technical, practical channel for a second, and bringing in a little bit of the reality principle. We know the world that we're living in, but let's assume things go as well as one could imagine them realistically going. A year from now, where are we in terms of progress down the various roads that we've talked about? What will be the hopeful place we could land at?
In my preferred outcome, we have IAEA inspectors at multiple North Korean facilities that are monitoring the freeze of production. We have a process in which they're trying to get at what has been made and produced, which includes the taking of environmental samples and trying to use scientific techniques for getting a better understanding of their program. We have, as much as I don't want to focus too much on it, we have no nuclear tests, no new missile tests. And we essentially are beginning a process of integrating North Korea's program more fully into the international system, bringing about an ability to address concerns, find out where we are, and then when we have a problem, move forward from there. I don't know that we could even realistically in a year we might be able to achieve, in my best case scenario, I guess, we've removed a whole bunch of fissile material, preferably all of it, from North Korea, and maybe destroyed quite a few delivery systems. I mean, that would be, those two things coupled with a freeze and monitoring would be sort of my best case scenario outcome, but it's extremely challenging to do.
I would say that by the end of the year, we should, if there is North Korean cooperation, and of course that's a big if, be able to be in a position in which North Korean weapons no longer pose a threat to the United States or North Korea's neighbors in the region. The program could be defanged. Removal of the production facilities and dismantlement of them will take longer.
Rebecca, did you want to jump in?
All right. I mean, I think the bigger question is, it doesn't take a year to decide what we're actually negotiating about, so we can do that. It doesn't take a year to begin a process of monitoring and inspection, so that's something that can be done quickly. And it doesn't take a year, you can pick, where you go, but it doesn't take a year to begin a process of disablement and removal. Completion is way far out, but in a year, but let's face it, actually in a few months, you could have started those things. And then I would feel a lot better about what could actually be done in a year.
Great. Well, I think that is a good place to sort of leave things in terms of this piece of the conversation. We should open it up to the audience right now. We have people running, with microphones. So let's just start over here. Great.
Peter Humphrey, I'm an intel analyst and a former diplomat. I note that the Libyan and Syrian programs were off-the-shelf kits from Pakistan and North Korea, respectively, so there's zero analogy value there. I also note that the tunneling expertise of North Korea is astonishing, and in fact, there are North Korean tunnelers helping Hezbollah, Hamas, and Iran. So thinking that a tunnel couldn't be redug in a few weeks is a fantasy. So that was no gift whatsoever. My question is, a very low threshold move would be the emplacement of sensors, particularly molecular sniffing sensors and radiation sensors at appropriate locations around these supposed nuclear sites in North Korea. It's a very low threshold kind of thing to ask for. Has anybody brought up that subject as a possibility, as a step one? The real virtue there is that it could be done by the end of this month.
Well, I will just give a shout out to the ICG report here, actually, and I know you and John Wolfstall and others have talked a lot about this, of the idea that the North Koreans could sign the Comprehensive Test Ban Treaty and become a member of that. It's not a treaty that's enforced yet because we and others have not ratified it, but they could sign it and they could allow the CTBTO to come into North Korea and place some of those sensors, become part of that remote sensing operation, and provide a little bit of confidence there. So I do think it's not, if they were to just do that, would that give me a lot of confidence that we're making big progress? I would say no. But I do think that that is an element that could be useful, and it goes back to, again, this is in your report, and what we've talked about here is trying to define what is this freeze, and how would you monitor that? And one way of monitoring that is having, that's not to say that the CTBTO can't do it now because they have sensors in other parts of Asia, but certainly putting them in the DPRK would be a nice added benefit.
So the problem isn't the speed with which technical monitoring could be in place. Of course, that could be done quickly, like a lot of other monitoring things. The problem is what will be declared, whether it's a partial or preliminary declaration or a comprehensive declaration, that is worth monitoring. In other words, that's the issue. Once something's declared and you have an agreement to put any type of monitoring, whether it's human inspectors or technical or other things, then all of that becomes possible.
Did you want to jump in more? I mean, one of the other benefits, of course, of putting sensors on the ground is that if activity resumes, there's usually at least a little bit of a warning light in the sense that they tend to be disabled, and that can leave space for a political intervention. This is something we talk about in our report as well. Who's next?
This conversation seems to be moving in the direction of the U.S. eventually accepting North Korea as a nuclear weapon state. I mean, we're talking about the potential of signing the Comprehensive Test Ban Treaty. The president soon after Singapore tweeted that the threat has been removed. Words to that effect. He said this at rallies as well. So the question is, are we inevitably going to end up in that situation? And also, what constitutes North Korea not posing a threat to the United States? How do you define that? As we know, of course, there are other nuclear powers who do not threaten the United States. Presumably, they are not threatened.
You want to lead us off, Will?
Sure. I'll take, I guess, the last question first. North Korea not posing a threat to the United States. Of course, and it's important to remember that North Korea's threat is not only the long-range ICBMs, but there are 300,000 Americans who are living in South Korea. There are probably hundreds of thousands of Americans in Japan. There's Guam in the region. There are U.S. allies very close. So the threat is not only the long-range missiles. And so therefore, to remove that threat would take removal not only of the nuclear program, but most all of the missile program as well. North Korea poses a huge threat to Seoul on a conventional basis, and that's a problem too. So my argument would be that very likely you'd have to have some sort of political transformation in order for North Korea not to pose a threat to the United States or its allies. With respect to whether or not the United States is moving toward a recognition of North Korea as a nuclear state, I hope that that does not happen. I hope it remains US policy to oppose North Korea as a nuclear state. I mean, there are some realities we cannot fix, but we can maintain our opposition to them, and over the long haul, perhaps affect the outcomes that we seek. And if in fact these latest breakthroughs turn into be more dead ends, I would say that we should turn quickly to a policy of containment and deterrence that would impose costs on the North for its continued pursuit of nuclear weapons.
Do you want to argue for recognizing North Korea as a
No,
nuclear
I was
state?
actually going to make a very legalistic nerd point, which is that I think our policy, it's a good question if it still is, but our policy certainly into the six-party talks period was that North Korea return to the Non-Proliferation Treaty and to IAEA safeguards. And there is no way to return to the NPT as a nuclear weapon state. The only way is to come back as a non-nuclear weapon state. So while we may admit the reality that North Korea, of course, has nuclear explosive devices, I agree with Will, I don't think we should be recognizing them as a nuclear state, and we should get that goal of them coming back into the NPT, which is good not only for North Korea, but for the broader global non-proliferation regime.
But it does sound like, at least if we're talking about moving from a frame of CVID to a frame of risk reduction, that even if formal recognition is something that most people think would be a bridge, way too far, that there is at least a reorientation of some of the expert community to the idea of de facto recognition. Is that too far?
I think we're confusing two things. There's a big difference between legitimizing North Korea as a nuclear weapons state and acknowledging the fact that North Korea is a nuclear-armed adversary and needing to posture ourselves accordingly. I mean, we do not want to be naive or kind of play, kind of games. Yeah, that's sort of that's crazy. So, for the purpose of addressing the threat and what would make it go away, well, they would have to be both no longer nuclear armed and no longer an adversary, and those two things go together when we think about what is the ultimate, elimination of a threat. None of those conditions exist today.
That's a very helpful question and useful clarification. Thank you. Up here?
James Gitfield from Blank Media. The comment was made that the worst case scenario here is for them to pretend to be denuclearized and for us to pretend that we believe that's happening. You all have expressed extreme skepticism. I suspect Secretary Downpayment probably shares that at this point. How do we judge if that is indeed what's happening? Be as specific as possible for a journalist. I'm looking for signs that maybe we're falling into that trap that you survived. What am I exactly looking for?
Signs of being entrapped. Will, you want to take it?
Well, I would look at the program of denuclearization. What's entailed? Is it weapons? Is it fissile material? Is it delivery vehicles? Does it include the production facilities? Many of the things that I listed in my slides. And then I would look at the credibility of the verification effort. And I return to it. This is IAEA methodology. This is not heresy. A complete and correct declaration is the bedrock of any effective verification program. Now, as Richard mentioned, states sometimes make mistakes, but there's a big difference between a mistake in a declaration and omissions and, frankly, lies of the sort that the North Koreans submitted in their declaration in, for example, 2007 or 8, in which the contradictions of the declaration were effectively embedded in the paper that they submitted it on.
But there's also a question about how do we know if the U.S. is beginning to sort of very consciously kid itself and maybe not project accurately to the public what's the status of this enterprise. And I don't know, Richard or Rebecca, if you want to weigh in on that.
I actually think it's fairly simple. It can get difficult, but for the most part, it's a question of do you have a rhetoric and action mismatch? You know, if words are running way ahead of deeds, I'd start to worry about that.
Are they, Richard?
Well, I mean, I would agree, and I would say that even though the IAEA is not in place in North Korea, they still regularly report on them. So even in the worst case scenario, if our government is not saying what we would like them to say factually, there will be other people in the international community that will comment on the state of North Korea's nuclear program. And you can look to the independent verifiers, which are the IAEA experts. And I should just add on Will's point, he's right, there's a big difference between a mistake and a clear, blatant omission or lie in declaration. My only point is that the IAEA process, which is not heresy, allows for an iterative approach. So we shouldn't delude ourselves. I think the North Koreans, you know, I had that declaration in my drawer for a while, and it was pretty thin. But we should assume that they're not going to say what they're going to say. But it doesn't mean that that is an immediate stop to the process. We use the process to our advantage to get them to admit the things that they didn't tell us.
If I could just add on that, I think also, you know, we didn't talk about it much, but it's really important. How do you multilateralize this, both with the presence of an international organization, but perhaps other countries?
Yeah.
Because down the road, you'll get to some sort of he said, she said moment, and having, you know, other adults that are listening to the conversation can help a lot to know who's right.
Great.
Right here.
I'm a journalist with China Press, so my focus is probably focus on the broader context of the regional players. I wondered, where do we see the regional players in this denuclearization process? Like South Korea, China, and then Japan. What might be an effective strategy to engage those players? Thank you.
So that's going to be a big topic for the next panel as well, but maybe we can take a crack at it, at least from the sort of pragmatic perspective.
I mean, I would just throw out, again, a plug for the concept of a cooperative threat reduction strategy in which other regional players could help to take many different roles that both not only help give us assurance that North Korea is taking certain agreed steps, but also help to place the North Korean regime possibly in a path to turn away from these types of programs and do things that are innocuous or things that are less threatening to the United States and to our allies. So, you know, China and Russia are nuclear weapon states. They know a lot about this. They could play a role, whether it's in verification, whether it's in facilitating the transactions of equipment, technology, movement of things, training, and also, you know, I think the ROK government in particular is very interested in a sustainable outcome here. So they may have, you know, it may simply be, you know, donors, you know, funding to go and help to facilitate certain programs. The American taxpayer may not want to pay for certain things that, you know, their money going off to North Korea, but maybe ROK, you know, constituents are less concerned about that. So I think that there's a key role just technically for the regional players, and certainly politically, if a U.S.-North Korea bilateral dialogue is getting too far ahead of where others in the region are comfortable, and again, our next panel will talk about that, that's not sustainable either. And so there's going to have to be a lot of continued communication with folks in the neighborhood.
Historically, the United States has been the nation that has been most focused on the importance of effective verification. My guess is that whatever would satisfy the United States would satisfy the other participants in the region, and in fact, some of them may try and pull the United States away from its most stringent aspirations.
Okay. Anybody else?
We stumped them.
No more questions? I have one last question, and then I think we started a little early and we'll probably wrap a little early, but it deals with the scope of what we're talking about. And Rebecca, this is an expertise for you. We've been talking about denuclearization, but occasionally in these conversations you hear people start speaking about chemical and biological weapons as well, and as though it weren't challenging enough to think about denuclearization. Should those elements be wrapped into what we're talking about when we're talking about addressing the nuclear threat in North Korea? And how do we think about that?
So it's not the easiest question. I think this is a place where trying to understand where are we looking at that comprehensive agreement and where are we looking at step by step and or some hybrid in between. I think these programs are really important. I think it's highly problematic to come up with a comprehensive deal that leaves chemical and biological weapons programs fully aside. Because you're just you're going to allow them to come in and substitute those in some ways strategically. There's just a lot of problems, even from an international legal perspective. Those are also equally prohibited under international law. You're really going to say, join this treaty, but not these, and we're going to then recognize you as chem biostate. I mean, it's kind of difficult to picture how you would do that. That said, there are questions about what do you do first. And you could do a few things. It might be there was some confidence building you could do in those areas to reduce risks there. Maybe that would be, easier in some cases. So I think we need kind of two paths for it. And what we can't do is just sort of pretend they don't exist. We're going to have to just acknowledge the fact that, North Korea is a triple threat. And it doesn't really help to focus on one and ignore the other two.
Just triple?
Just triple? I hope not much more, but no, I don't disagree. I think the complexity factor just goes up and up and up. And I'm not a chem bio expert, but from what I know from people who are, the dual use nature of those programs is even greater and even more of a concern than the nuclear. And so, even if they agreed to, accede to the CWC and provide a declaration to the OPCW, then the question is, well, but what they still have a facility that could make X thing. And so how do you assure against that? So I think it does add to the complexity. I think you can't ignore it. I'm a nuke guy, so I want to get at the nuke stuff first, but I think you can't say that it doesn't exist.
I wouldn't take chemical and biological weapons off the table, but I'd go after the nuclear program first, both because we have the most experience with it and because, frankly, I think it poses the greatest threat and the greatest military utility for the North. If, against my predictions, we actually succeed in the nuclear program, it may give us both the confidence and the expertise to pursue the other programs.
Great. Well, thank you, everybody, for being a great and active audience. And thank you to our terrific panelists for their wonderful presentations. And please join me in giving them a round of applause.
Thank you for that wonderful discussion. We will now have a 20-minute break and come back here shortly for our next panel. Thank you again. Join me in welcoming. Thanking our panelists.
Thank you very much. My name is David Nakamura. I am a reporter for the fake news Amazon Washington Post. Perhaps you've heard about us from the president's Twitter feed as recently as maybe this morning. I cover the White House along with a team of many others at the Post. Technically, there's 6 of us, but many in the newsroom, of course, write about what's happening. And we've seen that just yesterday, we had a front page story by a team at the Post that did not include me about Trump and North Korea and the president growing a bit frustrated with the process which inspired the presidential tweet storm. That story was anchored by my colleague John Hudson, give a shout out to, who covers the State Department, as well as Josh Dawsey and Carol Lenig, 2 other great reporters at the Post. But I do cover North Korea quite a bit and Asia policy generally. And I was in North Korea as part of our team that was was in Singapore. Important difference. As part of our team that was covering the Singapore summit. Now, lots happened since then. I wanted to thank CSIS and John Hamry for involving me in the panel, and so with a great cast of experts here we can hear from, as well as the International Crisis Group, which I think is providing also some support for this event. I personally have a soft spot for CSIS, not only for their roster of terrific bipartisan experts, but also because I met the woman who would become my wife here 15 years ago when she worked here. So thanks to CSIS for that. But that's not why I quote their experts. I also wanted to say one thing, a shout out to Victor Cha, who all of you know, I'm sure well, was going to join us on the panel. Can't, unfortunately, but has been someone who's been invaluable to reporters and to, I think, the public's general understanding of what's happening. I rely on Victor quite a bit. He put up with a lot of pestering calls in January for reasons you may remember, for his personal situation, but really thankful to him. Without further ado, let me introduce quickly our roster of experts here, and we can get right into questions. Sitting right to my left is General Walter Skip Sharp, who many of you probably know as the former commander of the ROK U.S. forces on the Korean Peninsula. And it's terrific for us to have his expertise here, because not only we get somebody who's been right there in the region, but someone who obviously has a view from the military and the Pentagon. And we'll be interested to see how their view, in his mind, squares with the White House in this particular case or not, as President Trump talks about potentially down the line withdrawing or downsizing troops from the peninsula. Next to him, of course, is CSIS's own Sumi Terry, someone who I do talk to on the phone, from her expertise as a former CIA official, I think from 2001 to 2008, and someone with great insights into the intelligence community's views on this, and has had first-line experiences serving in an administration in a White House. I think also served in the Obama administration, or overlapped into that time, and as someone who also, of course, is an expert on Korea and that particular region. And finally, Chris Green of the International Crisis Group, Senior Advisor on Korea issues, and also serves as a researcher on North Korea studies with Leiden University in the Netherlands. Am I saying that right, Leiden? Great. But Chris also is someone who could give us good insight from the perspective of North Korea, or at least some insights into thinking there, and that's really valuable. Something that journalists really struggle, obviously, to try to understand. Maybe all of us do, but Chris will be able to give us some of that. Just briefly, before we even landed back from Singapore, you guys may remember President Trump had landed, I think, on June 13th, didn't waste time getting back, and declared on Twitter there was no longer a nuclear threat from North Korea. So he did, problem solved, we're done. I think the panel can wrap up here. We'll talk a little bit long. July 6th, however, you guys know Mike Pompeo, the Secretary of State, arrived for 2 days of talks in North Korea. That didn't go so great. As you remember, he did not get a meeting with Kim Jong-un, which was something of an embarrassment because he had on his first 2 trips. Then the state media in North Korea criticized what they called the unilateral and gangster-like demand for denuclearization from the North. By July 12th, President Trump, I think trying to counter some of the idea that things weren't going great, released a very nice note from Kim Jong-un, citing epochal progress and a meaningful journey and a new future. The president said in a tweet that great progress is being made. July 18th, the president said that he was in no rush in the negotiations. When he was talking to reporters at the White House, he said discussions are ongoing, they're going very well, we have no rush for speed, no time limit, no speed limit, we're just going through the process. Yesterday, the Post had its story, among other publications, in which the president behind the scenes was showing signs of frustration despite what he had said publicly. And if you haven't read the story, it talks about him wanting updates quite a bit about what's happening, where's the progress, and being frustrated. We know when the president starts either ranting at the TV or his aides, that's a sign that things aren't going so great. I think that's what happened. This morning you woke up to a couple of things. Number one is war with Iran seems to have replaced war with North Korea as our top threat in the president's mind, given his tweet last night. And now this morning, in sort of countering what our story said, it appears the president said in a tweet, all of Asia is happy with the progress in North Korea, criticized the fake news, saying we rely on anonymous sources, and then right after that had a couple tweets about the Washington Post and Amazon. So I wanted to just sort of jump right into some questions for our panel, if I could. And I think the first one is, I would say, looking back a year, given where we were around this time last year, we had a very busy fall with the president talking about the little rocket man and so on. We've now had such an important summit, had worldwide attention, is historical no matter which way you slice it. Are we better off now, or are we worse off than we were a year ago? Jen?
Well, thanks. And thanks to CSIS, the crisis group, for being able to be part of this group here today. I really appreciate the opportunity to do that. And thanks for sending some of the questions you're going to ask anyway, to give us a little bit of a chance beforehand to think about it. So I did write down a couple things that I believe where we're better off today than we were a year ago, some that are worse, and some that we really don't know. So let me just go down that, and then I'll conclude with where I kind of think we are compared to a year ago today. As General Brooks recently pointed out at Aspen, we are better off because there have not been any provocations since 29 November 2017. Provocations being defined as missile tests or nuclear tests. You can argue whether that is part of their normal testing cycle or not, but I think we're better off because they have not happened than if they would have happened and would have continued anything at the rate that they were happening before 29 November. The THAAD deployment in Korea is complete. It is operational. It is prepared to help defend South Korea. We're better off there today than we were a year ago. 2nd Infantry Division has become stronger because it is a combined division now with U.S. and ROK soldiers actually part of that structure as a combined division going together. The United Nations Command has gotten stronger, not only in capability because of working through some exercises, but because they have got stronger and more high-level support from other countries. A 3-star Canadian deputy is about to become the United Nations commander, and many other nations are also increasing their strength and their staff that are part of there. South Korea is stronger because they have continued to fund their defense at a very high level compared to our other allies. Global Hawk will be deployed there shortly. They've agreed to buy P-8. And just generally across the board, they are funding their defense at a very high level, at a higher level. A nuclear site, you can argue whether it was already destroyed or not, but a nuclear site has been destroyed. So that makes us better than we were a year ago because that site was there. Potentially a missile test site was destroyed. I think we're still not quite clear on where that is. Sanctions pressure seems to be marginally holding. It's holding, I think, the pressure that North Korea has felt and continues to feel today is stronger because of the sanctions than they were a year ago. UN Security Council still at least is saying that the goal is total denuclearization in the countries as part of the UN Security Council. That has not shifted, at least what they're saying. You could argue the enforcement, and I'll get to that in a minute. And then just a couple others, some detainees have been released, hotlines are in place and being used. Talks at all different levels are occurring, to include some very high levels, both diplomatically and militarily. And there have been some joint ventures together with sports teams and things like that. And I think we're at a greater potential of getting MIA POW remains back today than we were a year ago. And there's greater potential for family reunions. So that's somewhat of a list of areas that I think we are better in. Areas that we are worse in. and I'll be careful how I say this, we are not as strong as we could be today and over the next several months because we suspended the exercise that's coming up. It's not saying, be careful, we have a very strong capability. Suspending one exercise isn't going to kill us. We're still going to be able to help. We're still going to be able to very successfully defend against any sort of conventional attack. But every time you have an exercise, you get stronger. So us not having this exercise or suspending this exercise, I put that in the worst category. The complexity of the war plans, the need to synchronize all different types of forces, both within the US and Korea, the rotation of forces that we have, the rather short time period that South Korean troops are actually part of their military, make recurring and often exercises critical to the alliance over there. So there are lower level exercises and all that is continuing at a good degree and over there. But I put that in the worst category, that we're not doing this exercises. One that's not talked about by much, but I still am very confident it is really growing, is the North Korea cyber threat. Nobody seems to be talking about that right now, but their capabilities and what they've demonstrated in the past and continue today, I think their capabilities in the cyber arena has grown over the last year because we've really done nothing to try to reduce that. Human rights abuses continue. I don't see any evidence that has gotten any better. In fact, I think it's getting worse. The recent proclamation by Kim Jong-un that he's going to release some political prisoners, we'll see. I have not seen evidence that has happened. Probably in the worst place that worries me a lot is where I start to see that even in the UN Security Council, folks are starting to talk about reducing sanctions before I think we see any progress on denuclearization. So those are my main things in the worst area. In the unknown area, we don't know whether Kim Jong-un and his people, his scientists, have continued to do what Kim Jong-un ordered in his New Year's resolution, his New Year's speech. He ordered the nuclear and rocket industry should mass produce nuclear weapons and ballistic missiles this year. I've seen no counter to that. I've not heard him come out and say, no, don't do that anymore. I believe it is happening. We do not know Kim Jong-un's real intent and his true willingness to give up nuclear weapons. I do not believe. You take all of that together, I think we are in a better place marginally, but I worry very much that we're at a point right now where we're going to reduce pressure, we're going to just declare victory, and things will go back to kind of where they were back in the old cycle, where we'll declare victory, things are going right. We'll give Kim Jong-un a little bit so that he can continue to survive some more. He'll then demand more, and then we'll go back in the cycle. We were, I think, very effective for several years of not getting in that cycle. I worry we're getting back in that cycle now as we see no progress at all in the denuclearization side.
It's alarming.
Thank you.
Given every time I talk with White House officials, they say we're not going to repeat the mistakes of the past, but they might not. The president, we don't know. Sumi?
Well, General Sharp just gave very comprehensive answer, and I don't disagree. So I agree with almost everything you said, I think all. Yeah, we're better off if we're comparing to the time where we're talking about preventive war. Bloody nose, fire and fury, little man on a suicide mission, rocket man, right? All of that totally destroy North Korea. Sure, we are better off, 100%. But if we are still talking about the goal being complete, verifiable, irreversible dismantlement, I'm not saying that should be, maybe it should be something else, but if that's our goal, and that is what we are saying, dismantlement of North Korea's nuclear program, we're not better off. There is no evidence that we're better off. From the Singapore summit, we have this very vague aspirational statement. That is just exactly that, aspirational statement, talking about North Korea working towards denuclearization of the Korean peninsula. We've heard this many, many times from North Korea before. We still don't have a definition, agreement on that definition. What does that mean? First of all, work towards. We got more out of North Koreans before, right? Where they have agreed to give up. So this working towards stuff, that doesn't really work. I work towards a lot of stuff. That's what does that mean, work towards? And then Korean Peninsula part, North Korea always meant not what we meant, dismantlement of their nuclear program. They always meant U.S.-South Korea alliance commitment, U.S. troops in South Korea, withdrawing that, U.S. nuclear extended umbrella that we have over South Korea and Japan, pull out of U.S. forces. So that's what they all meant previously. And it's still not any clearer that we now have some sort of agreement on that. So we don't have agreement, not on the definition. And we know that things are not going well, no matter what President Trump says. Secretary Pompeo went to North Korea in his third visit, did not get to meet with Kim Jong-un, even though he got to meet with him twice before. That was not a good trip. And the fact that North Korea is not really playing already hardball, even things like just returning the remains of the U.S. servicemen. Why are you playing such a hardball? I mean, why are you being so difficult if there was supposed to be an easy give? So I think, again, if that's a strategy, we're not any better off. And what I'm concerned about is that our options are not great. In fact, we're narrowing our options. Kim Jong-un is in a better negotiating position as a result of premature summit when we're not ready, meaning I'm not opposed to the summit, I'm not opposed to engagement, I'm not opposed to any of that, but we should have had an agreement on at least knowing a sort of a definition on the denuclearization before we had the summit. So now Kim Jong-un is better off. All this maximum pressure, let's face it, it's not, every single day we're getting reports that implementation of sanctions are loosening, right? Because China is not really implementing sanctions. We're getting different reports every day. Just this week, we alluded to that, when China and Russia is pushing back when we're trying to, because of this report that came out about some 81 transfer of ship-to-ship refined petroleum products to North Korea that has occurred since May 30th. So implementation, so what's our option B? Do we have an option B if this thing does not go the way we want to go? Again, sanctions it's hard to get back to this fire and fury rhetoric. How do we get back to that? Particularly if North Korea does not conduct any more tests, and I don't think they will, because Kim Jong-un is a very shrewd man. He's been playing this quite well. He's not going to get back to missile and nuclear tests. So are we crazy? How are we going to get back to this rhetoric of fire and fury? And even if we do, that's not credible the second time around. So already that part, it's not. So I think all in all, we don't have a lot of options. It's unclear to me if the administration actually has a clear option B. So in that regard, if you're talking about denuclearization, I would just argue that we're not, and maybe we're not any worse off, but we're certainly not better off.
Christian.
That's now two extremely comprehensive lists and explanations, leaving me with relatively little to say. But to point out that, is South Korea better off now than it was a year ago? I think from a defense perspective, yes. Everything that General Sharp said makes perfect sense. But there is now pressure being imposed on the Moon administration from South Korean society, from business people who have been given a hint of a possibility of an investment opportunity coming up. That is, without North Korea really doing very much at all, slowly dividing the United States and South Korea. I think the Moon administration has done a tremendous job of staying in line with the Trump administration on this, but that won't last forever, and we're already seeing a few cracks on the fringes. So North Korea's position is, as Dr. Terry said, getting better without them really doing very much. In fact, doing nothing is partly the key for North Korea at this point.
I wanted to see, we talked about Pompeo going to North Korea earlier this month, coming back fairly empty-handed. How does the U.S., is there a way for the U.S. to salvage this, and what would that look like? I don't know if General Sharp.
No, go ahead, you go first.
First of all, can we get the president to stop tweeting? Yeah. Because that tweet this morning is not helpful. Beyond the fact he first said the North Korean crisis, like he's resolved that it's no more, he said it very happy. Japan is happy, the whole region is happy, and I'm very happy with the progress. So this does not, if you're a North Korean leader, President of the United States just tweeted that he's very happy with the progress. What incentive do you have to do anything than what you're doing? So I think, again, step number one would be maybe not tweet, and because I think that undercuts any kind of pressure. We cannot give North Koreans, if anything, we should be giving North Koreans an ultimatum. You've agreed to this, here's a period of time. Not tomorrow, maybe not a month, give it till November, right? Okay, till the election. But this is what you have to do. You have to give a declaration of all your stuff first, and some sort of timeline, some sort of roadmap. If not, we're getting back to what? I mean, there's no, but instead of even saying that, President saying, I'm very happy. So I think that's start number one, is to sort of, somehow get the president to stop tweeting.
General?
I mean, on the Pompeo visit, there aren't many Secretary of State equivalents that come to the United States and get a presidential visit. I'm more concerned with the fact that who Pompeo met with seemed to have the lack of authority or guidance or anything on what are the next steps, and not have the ability to be able to negotiate that and to get those discussions down. I agree with Sumi that pressure and putting some timeline rather than just a long time, because a long time is a long time, but putting that pressure as for saying, okay, here's what needs to happen, and making that very public to Kim Jong-un is a critical element here, which I've not seen us do. Otherwise, as I said in my opening remarks, I think a year from now we'll be in a place of declaring victory and nothing has happened along the denuclearization side.
General, I was curious from your point of view on something, which is you talked about critically the suspension of the full legal military.
Ultra Freedom Guardian.
Oh, it's a Freedom Guardian. Oh, yeah, right. The full legal was the previous one. Sorry. The suspension of those military exercises between the United States and South Korea. I'm curious. The president has also talked about potentially downsizing the footprint of the U.S. military on the peninsula. There's been reports in the past that General Mattis, when on various issues over the past year and a half, when he's been concerned about the president maybe moving too quickly on a national security issue that involves the Pentagon, has to some degree slow-walked, maybe presenting him options. How would the military leaders potentially do that in this case? Do you see that as a possibility of somehow working against whatever the president's goals are, if they're deemed a little bit too risky?
I'm not sure I understand.
Well, I didn't know if there's a way for the Pentagon to sort of push back, maybe not necessarily with this suspension of military exercises, but in terms of giving him options or in giving him ideas about how to. Do you see that at Pentagon considering such things?
I mean, I'm very confident that Secretary Mattis and the Department of Defense have laid out all kinds of options, military options to deal with deterrence, to deal with defense, to deal with possible bloody nose types of options as it goes through. The reduction of troops over there, I don't see that as an option in the near term. Sometime well after denuclearization and you have peace and security in Northeast Asia completely, sure, there's options to take a look at that period. But I think what you're getting at, which I do not believe is happening, is that the Pentagon is saying, okay, the president was talking about this, let's put options together which say this is not the right way to go. Again, if you are inferring that they're going behind his back to try to do something.
We're slowing it down, I meant to sort of, anyway. You don't see that?
No.
Okay.
Yeah, that's
fair.
That's not how the Pentagon operates.
Right, no, that's good to know. Thank you. I wondered what the panel thinks about where we go from here if there is continued to be no progress. You've talked about the fact that you don't see, Sumi, Kim Jong-un testing any more weapons to this degree. What would happen in your mind that could set us back to President Trump returning to that rhetoric of Little Rocket Man and talk about potential military confrontation?
So as I mentioned, I think it's very difficult absent provocation from North Korea in the form of missile tests or nuclear tests, and I don't think Kim Jong-un would do that. So and I think what Kim Jong-un is going to do, I mean, of course nobody knows, but if I could just, guess, he would probably, we were talking about cutting the salami really, really thin, right? He's gonna just give enough just to keep this going. There will be a smart play for Kim Jong-un, right? First, return the remains of your servicemen, and then later down, dismantle the test engine site that he said would dismantle, so that's not a big deal. So make these more cosmetic concessions that then the Trump administration can take and sort of call it more of a success, working towards denuclearization and move that way. I think that's how it's going to go. But to answer your question about then what's going to require for President Trump to return to this fire and fury rhetoric, I think would be something that North Korea somehow miscalculates and greatly embarrasses the president or even Secretary Pompeo. Remember last time President Trump initially, when he stopped saying, I'm not going to have this summit, it was because of that kind of statement coming out of North Korea. That's deeply embarrassing. Or perhaps after the election, I think there was some sort of internal struggle, I would imagine, from somebody like National Security Advisor Bolton to Secretary Pompeo, when there's no progress at all. There's no movement forward. At some point, it has to be, and all of us are saying, where is something? Where is the declaration? You got to give us something. At that point, he may turn to, particularly if Bolton wins out, if there's this kind of struggle between the cabinet members. But I think until the November, if North Koreans are smart and give just something, keep giving it, very, very, small, but that we can turn it into a win, I think this is how it's going to be more or less. This is how it's going to proceed, I think.
Chris, I'm wondering if you could talk a little bit maybe from the regional perspective, and particularly I was curious what you think about North Korea's calculus here.
I think this is absolutely right. And if North Korea does do little things that reverberate well with President Trump's base, they will regard this as progress. Polling suggests that the American public is basically in favor of Trump's North Korea policy to date. That's the important thing, arguably, rather than actually making progress. And I'm not convinced, therefore, that it's in the Trump administration's interests to issue an ultimatum, which would, in any case, because of what went on in 2017, lack any credibility in all probability. If you can't back it with a threat of force, because that ship has sailed in 2017. So it's a very difficult position.
Chris, I'm wondering if you could give any sense of, I know it's hard to understand what's happening in Pyongyang on their own political calculus, but any insights about, and also maybe in Seoul, about the idea of a second meeting between President Trump and Kim Jong-un. This has been talked about. I think maybe the rumor of somehow Kim would arrive in New York for the UN General Assembly in September, make a trip all the way to the United States, which may have been unthinkable so recently. What do you think about that from North Korea's perspective, and even in South Korea?
I think that Kim has shown himself to be a pretty good political player internationally. He's willing to engage with world leaders, but I don't think he'd be willing to attend the UN General Assembly. I don't think that fits in with their modus operandi for the personalist dictatorship, the way they run their country and the way their leader is portrayed. So I don't think that's terribly likely, but I wouldn't put it past Kim being willing to come for a bilateral meeting in the United States, hypothetically speaking.
Well, I just wanted to jump in on that because I'm not sure. Just having watched Kim Jong-un in the last few months and roaming around Singapore taking a selfie, which was truly a remarkable sight, I do think there's a possibility, particularly that he could come to New York, and that would just be the finale of what he's been doing. He met with President Xi Jinping 3 times, South Korean president twice, and hosted Russian foreign minister, met with President Trump. I mean, why not? Like very Gaddafi-like fashion, come to New York. New Yorkers were hated because of the massive traffic, but stand there and give that speech, and he would have arrived. This is like that's true leader of a normal country. So I think we may have to consider that possibility. And if Kim Jong-un decides that that's what he wants to do, but then he would have to give something beyond just returning the U.S. servicemen. I think it has to be some sort of declaration or a disablement of that facility or something for us to sort of be able to give, otherwise we can't really quite extend that kind of invitation. But I do think there's a possibility.
Yeah, I agree with Sumi. I think because of Kim Jong-un's desire to have international, presence and validity, I think he probably will come to the UN General Assembly. And my prediction is that the president will see him at the UN General Assembly.
We want to take some odds
This
here.
is something verifiable that's come out of this. We can check this.
I don't know that he will invite him to D.C.
Yeah, right.
We'll hop over to Mar-a-Lago and have that hamburger. and the most beautiful chocolate cake ever.
Let's see if he can make a hole in one on every hole.
I think we're in Bedminster time frame in September.
If he does come, I do believe the president will see him if he comes. Again, and I don't think that's a bad thing. It's an opportunity, another opportunity to pressure him. Yes, it gives Kim Jong-un more of an international name and all of that, but that's where we are. We're into trying to get as much pressure as we can.
Much pressure as we can. I don't think anybody's giving up on that yet. I think we all hope that we make some progress. But I wonder, are we Kim Jong-un has made a number of trips, we know that, outside his borders in such a short time frame. He has not given up a whole lot, other than maybe some of the suspension of his tests and the return of the detainees and some of the other things you mentioned, which are to some degree significant. But on the big question about his real intent to denuclearize, we still don't know. And it doesn't seem like he's given any reason for us to feel more optimistic since the summit. But I wonder if we are headed toward some sort of status quo, given that both sides may want to declare victory in some sort of stasis as long as there's no other resumption of missile and nuclear tests. And then are we sort of having a new policy where we have to sort of acknowledge that they have arrived at some sort of nuclear power status and just sort of try to transition into managing that in any way? I don't know if we see that in the Trump era in the next couple years at least. Who knows how long he'll be there, but or moving forward. I don't know if any of you have thoughts about that, whether we're now sort of headed, at least de facto, toward having now acknowledged that they're a nuclear power and having to live with it and try to just prevent any kind of disasters.
Well, I would say at least we know that this is North Korea's ultimate goal, is to get the international acceptance of North Korea as a responsible nuclear power, like India, like Pakistan. And I'm afraid that North Korea is actually, all indications point to North Korea potentially being able to achieve that goal. Just because already, I think, there was acknowledgement North Korea is a nuclear power, just having met with Kim Jong-un. And I think his goal is to buy time, to draw out, just wait out this administration. And so again, I think as long as they stop from testing, and I think that moratorium will continue, and as long as they just give a little bit at a time, that will drag on. And with a different administration come in, at some point, we might just have to sit down and have an arms control discussion with a nuclear weapons power. That's different from just right now, policy-wise, accepting North Korea as a nuclear weapons power. You can't, because as a policy, it has all kinds of implications, right? We worry about regional proliferation. We worry about what message does it send to countries like Iran. So I think as a policy, we're not going to declare the nuclear North Korea is that. But in reality, I'm concerned that we are headed in that direction.
Yeah, I agree in reality. I don't think we'll ever declare that they are. But I still believe that Kim Jong-un's ultimate goal is to have a capability, a nuclear second strike survivable capability that opens all kinds of options of coercion for him to be able to force South Korea and the other parts of Northeast Asia and the United States to give him all kinds of economic assistance, to be able to recognize him as a country and all. And ultimately, I still believe that there is a goal in North Korea for reunification under North Korean terms of some sort that's favorable to North Korea, and keeping that second strike survivable capable nuclear capability is key to that in Kim Jong-un's mind for, initial security, but then also the coercive power that he has. He said he's going to denuclearize. We haven't seen any progress that's moved towards that. I worry that, as I said earlier, we're back into this cycle that he's playing the long game. He's not playing, is there an election? I'll just leave it at that. He's playing the long game and sees that he has time because of his youth to be able to do that.
When I was writing about the search for an ambassador to Seoul from the United States, I watched some of the footage of General Harry Harris's testimony before he was nominated or had even been decided on to the House, maybe in the Appropriations Committee, I believe, maybe in the spring, in which, just picking up on your point, he testified that he believed the goal was still for North Korea to unify under North Korea control. And he said basically, that he was very alarmed by that. He's had really strong rhetoric, even at the time, because President Trump had already agreed to a summit. By then, I believe it was in March. I was curious what kind of impact, maybe I'll start with Chris, if now having an ambassador, having one who has a military point of view, but also has had pretty strong rhetoric. I'd written a piece saying, maybe that he and Pompeo and Bolton have all had this sort of hawkish rhetoric about North and skepticism, there to maybe set some guardrails for the president. But what impact might he have? And I wonder if you have any sense of how he's now on the ground there, if we can expect any kind of, what his role would be.
All the evidence is that he's extremely knowledgeable and extremely professional, and he will conduct his duties in an exemplary manner. And having someone on the ground in Seoul is always going to be better than having nobody there. So I would anticipate that this is a positive step forward. Yes, he has made very skeptical comments in the past about North Korea's motivations, but skepticism is not in short supply. So I think this is definitely a step forward. And to point to the point that was made just a moment ago about North Korea's aims ultimately being the reunifying with South Korea, that point of view is held by most people that I speak to in Seoul. Any knowledgeable analyst there would say exactly the same thing, but they simply put forward, in a lot of cases, a much simpler remedy. Right? They'd simply say, North Korea may have this ambition, but for us being South Korea, to avoid that outcome, what is required is for us to maintain a vibrant democracy, to continue with a kind of dynamic capitalist economy that North Korea cannot, under any reasonably foreseeable circumstances, swallow. So whether that is true or not, I'm not convinced that it's something that we need to concern ourselves with unduly at this point in time.
General, I don't know if you have any thoughts about the new ambassador and what kind of point of view.
Admiral Harry Harris is going to do a great job over there. He definitely knows the region. He knows not just Korea, knows very strongly the influences of China, what China is doing and not doing, very well understands what's happening with Japan and how to help strengthen the trilateral engagements between South Korea, United States, and Japan, and the importance of that, which I think really does need to continue to be strengthened, that are there. He will work very strong to help maintain the Korea-U.S. alliance. There are forces that are pulling that some right now, but I'm confident over the years that we've had the alliance together, it will remain very, very strong. I believe the strongest alliance that we have, but it will take work to be able to do that. And having someone like Admiral Harris over there to do that, along with all the other parts of our government that are working to do that, I think is very important. And I agree with you completely that I should have listed that as one of we're in a better place.
Yeah,
we have an ambassador now. I'll add that to my list. So.
You mentioned China. I'm curious, the panel talked a little bit about the regional politics and geopolitics, since we sort of touched on that. And I'm curious about China. President Trump has not been shy about blaming China when Kim Jong-un's rhetoric or Pyongyang's rhetoric takes a turn for the darker side. What do we think now that Kim has laid this groundwork with Beijing, where their relationship goes, whether we can expect more visits from Kim to Xi, and what that means for, sort of where President Trump goes with the pressure on China, and whether, he's right to be so skeptical of China's intentions here. Sumi?
Yeah, no, I think President Trump is right to be skeptical because, as we talked about, China is already loosening implementation of sanctions. After Xi Jinping met with Kim Jong-un 3 times, I fully expect that relationship to continue to take off. But what I'm curious about is this kind of, and I don't know much about, I'm not a trade economist, but it's an interesting time to pick a trade, be in a trade war with China, particularly if we need Chinese help on raiding North Korea. So I think we need to sort of sort that out at some point, because I don't see China having any incentive to help us raiding North Korea, particularly when there's moratorium on testing, which is what China cares about. And China's relationship with the United States is not so great. So there's no incentive there. And I do think one of the big winners of this whole past few months is China. China got exactly what China wanted in terms of suspension of joint military exercises. I think even more than North Korea, there was China's ask. Kim Jong-un actually earlier in this year even said that he was okay with joint military exercises. Then he went to China, had a meeting with Xi Jinping, and all of a sudden, after he came back, it's like all of a sudden this was an issue. So right out of the summit, one of the first things that President Trump did was to suspend military exercises. And I'm not even that upset about the suspension of joint military exercises because I think we can make an argument for it. I'm more upset about President Trump's rhetoric on describing the exercises because this was like North Korea's rhetoric. This is exactly what China and North Korea has been talking about when you say, these are war games, these are provocative, this is, all of that. Instead of saying these are defensive exercises and we do it because of a threat, but because in spirit of this diplomacy, we're going to suspend them. I just will conclude by my biggest fear is actually and I'm so glad that General Sharp said that you're not so worried about potentially, U.S. withdrawing troops or reducing troops and whatnot, because I feel like that is going to be China and North Korea combined. That's one of their priorities is to get to that goal.
Chris, I don't know if you have thoughts on that.
I think China-North Korea relations have entered a positive phase, which mirrors the positive phase they entered in October 2009, roughly speaking. That lasted until the end of 2013. I mean, we can argue over that, but that was when Kim Jong-un's uncle, Jang Song-taek, was executed, of course. Now, I think China is rather skeptical of North Korea's intentions, but is going to invest a certain amount in North Korea. And although sanctions have been loosened, there is a great deal more of that China can do going forward. So it's not as if they've simply discarded implementation at all at the first glance. But I don't expect China to think that this is going to last forever. They still think that they have a very recalcitrant, problematic pseudo-ally on their northeastern border. I don't think that perception is going to change anytime soon. It's just cyclical. This is the way of China-North Korea relations and has been for many decades.
I mean, China does not want a nuclear North Korea. China does not want war on the peninsula. And I think they're posturing what they're doing now to try to help influence North Korea and the actions that Kim Jong-un is taking is still much along those lines. They're trying to get, North Korea, Kim Jong-un to maintain what he has in a long enough fashion. So I worry that the sanctions, yes, I agree, there's still a lot of sanctions that they are enforcing, but I've seen too many years of China giving just enough to North Korea that North Korea continues to survive, especially in oil and fuel types of capabilities, that we're getting back into that era where China says, okay, we, again, playing the long game, we can nurse this for a long time, and my main goals of not having war here and hopefully reducing some of the nuclear thing is still a positive thing for me. And the other part of it that I do believe China is playing is how can we use this to our advantage to help split the Korea-U.S. alliance? Right. And a lot of that, some of that is coming from, because what we're hearing out of South Korea's desires for where we want to be moving in the future, what we're willing to do and all. I think China sees that as an opportunity, this as an opportunity to help break that down some.
And China has an incentive to promote trade and engagement with North Korea because its northeastern provinces are among the poorest in the country, and they would like to develop those using trade with North Korea as a way to do that. So that leaves us with the fact that there really is no incentive, or not a strong enough incentive, for China to quote unquote help us out. I mean, all of the incentives are running the other way.
I mean, I think like Sumi, I think, said earlier, you know, the incentive to potentially get us to where we were in China to support us was the bloody nose type of thing, that I believe there was a real concern in China that we could be about ready to go to war over here.
I mean, so I do think that, you know, when we actually saw China implementing sanctions in the fall, and it is true, because China's priority always has been no war, no instability, no nukes, and in that order, right? So they were actually spooked by the bloody nose talking coming out of Washington. And I do think, you know, China, we were very skeptical of China actually implementing sanctions, but China was doing much more than it has ever done in the fall of last year. But I think we have lost that leverage, or that, you know, because now I think China is reverting back to form.
Chris, maybe you could talk about this. I'm curious, you mentioned you know, China's interests economically with their neighbor. And I'm wondering we've talked a lot about the Trump administration, United States position in these negotiations, you know, what we want, and we have a lot to lose. But Kim Jong-un does too, right? I mean, he agreed to negotiate for a reason. Maybe it's to buy time, maybe it's for a political win, you know, consolidate power, be taken as a serious leader. But economically, you know, what is his view right now as to how to move forward on that? I was struck by, of course, when I was in Singapore, I wrote a recent story about President Trump's trip to Europe and how, unlike past presidents, he doesn't get out and sample local foreign countries and take tours of temples like past presidents, or give speeches to young people and so on. But even in Singapore, President Trump went to the hotel, he visited the Singaporean prime minister, and other than that, he stayed in his room. We know Kim Jong-un took a tour of hotel properties. I rushed down, you know, with a group of reporters to try to catch a glimpse of him. Saw him get in a limo, and they walked over the bridge. You know, he was doing kind of what presidents used to do, right? To go out and kind of get that photo op. But also the idea was he was touring economic development, seeing the waterfront. What does Kim want out of this? How fast does he want to, you know, sort of try to open and in any way, you know, show signs to his people that he's making progress on that? And you know, it struck me also that there was a CIA intelligence report about the idea that he might want a Western burger franchise of some sort. You know, what does that mean? What does that symbolize? And what are we to make of him doing that tour in Singapore?
Much is made of the idea that North Korea has pivoted away from military development towards economic development, and that this was declared by Kim Jong-un in April. Much is also made of the comment Kim Jong-un made early in his tenure as leader, that the North Korean people should not be made to tighten their belts anymore. Today's Nodong Shinmun, the Workers' Party newspaper, carried a commentary in which the writer, which is of course not analogous with Kim Jong-un's own words, but is nevertheless important, pointed out, even if we have to tighten our belts once again, we will continue until this state is 80 or 100 years old. I'm paraphrasing hopelessly, but it was something along those lines. The point being, the idea of tightening your belt again is part of the public discourse in North Korea, even still today. So while there is a certain amount of pressure from the bottom on the Kim Jong-un regime to improve access for ordinary mid-level Pyongyang families to opportunities for enrichment, I hesitate to use any phrase like broad-based economic development because I don't think that's something that is being discussed here. But there are families in Kim Jong-un's coalition of support who made quite a lot of money in the last 10 to 20 years from cross-border trade, mostly with China. And some of those people, anecdotal evidence suggests, have been suffering slightly in the 2017-2018 period of sanctions enforcement. So does Kim Jong-un want to alleviate that level of sanctions enforcement such that those families can go back to making money well and happily? Yes, he probably does. But does that require much movement on UNSC sanctions? Does that require much movement on sanctions with South Korea? Can it be done just by reducing Chinese sanctions enforcement on cross-border trade? Yes, it probably can. So I think Kim Jong-un's goals are relatively limited, and he's quite close to achieving them on the economic development front. I don't think it requires any major big bang changes to the sanctions regime that we have in place against North Korea.
So I agree with that for a short-term goal for Kim Jong-un. If he's the longer game, though, I think Kim Jong-un does realize that economic development, increased things for the people of South Korea longer term is absolutely required for his survival, because I believe that he sees that regardless of how strong he tries to control communications coming into North Korea, he sees more and more is getting in to North Korea. But the balance in his mind, I think, is, okay, how do I get this true economic development? In order to do that, I've got to have foreign folks come in and who I've got to, move to more freedoms type of thing. Is that going to cause real problems for me?
And my number one priority is security, right?
Exactly.
That's the thing I will never give up on.
Right. And so how do you balance all of that as it goes through? I think his concern of, you got to provide me security, assurance of security. I think that's not only in his mind from external, but also from potential internal as it goes in the future. I was actually very surprised about the tape, the movie that he took back from Singapore and showed to the North Korean people about, okay, here's what I did in Singapore. I think it's probably mostly about, well, you see, I can move around and look how much people like me and all of that. But you can't, get over the fact that they also see what those countries look like and what progress looks like down there. So I think I agree with you. Media just get enough sanctions so they can last a while, but that doesn't solve his problem for the long run.
Right. But the problem is, and I do agree with those people who say, Kim Jong-un, he is a young man, he's looking to rule next 40 to 50 years. Of course, he doesn't want to rule a poor, pariah, backward state, that he does want economic reform and so on. And so I agree with that. The problem is, even if he's making some incremental changes, what's going to happen is greater requests for more changes will come. And I don't know if he can control that.
Right.
How is he going to truly be able to open up his country to outside information? Because you can't do it without. No. And that would risk regime security. And is he really that kind of a transformative leader who's willing to also risk succession, dynasty, whatever, the whole system of North Korea to really transform his country economically? And I don't think there's any evidence right now that he is that kind of bold, transformative leader. Even if he wants to sort of change North Korea, he has that sense. I mean, he hated the airport, so he changed the airport. I mean, last 7 years he was busy building an amusement park, ski resort, horseback riding club, and so on. Whatever, he brought Western chefs, because he did live in the West. He did swim in French Riviera and skied in the Alps. And he gets that. But to really transform the country, it requires opening up the country. And I just don't know if we have any indication that he is that.
And we've already seen there is a certain amount of risk just in engaging South Korea, just in having talks with South Korea, meeting President Moon, unleashed a certain degree of societal discourse about North Korea's relations with South Korea, how things are likely to get better, how the possibility of unification could come. And that is the kind of wide-ranging societal discussion that the leadership does not want North Korean people to have. So that's already evidence of it's something that can be controlled now, but potentially, if they're not careful, it might not be controllable later. And they are simply not going to allow that point to come, I think.
I had one more question, then we're hoping to open up to the floor for some questions. I wondered about, if you not take North Korea off the table, but beyond North Korea. President Trump has spent a lot of time, like it or not, focusing on North Korea, his rhetoric, his team, obviously his time. Is there a strategy of this administration beyond North Korea, an Asia strategy that is broader? I spent a lot of time covering the Obama administration's Asia rebalance strategy, The idea was, obviously, we don't need to summarize for this group, but a broader strategy that incorporated diplomatic, defense, and economic engagement in the region, and obviously focusing on Southeast Asia as well as East Asia as sort of a way to sort of hedge on China. And that was the overall plan. Trump declared that dead, although others would say, look, we have to reckon with this, and they have this new sort of Indo-Pacific strategy. Is there one? Is there something beyond? Is Trump talking about anything beyond trade with China and trade deals individually and North Korea? And do you sense any kind of broader strategic framework here? Might be a short answer here. Be a yes, no. Does anybody want to take a stab, or we just want to go with it?
I feel as if the Trump administration is like a chess player who, unlike Garry Kasparov, can only see one or two moves ahead. So there's a strategy, but it really doesn't extend very far into the future. The US, of course, has a much longer term concerns, strategic interests that are not going to go anywhere. But on the Trump administration level, I'm afraid I don't think that they're thinking that many moves ahead.
Anyone else? No?
I mean, the only thing that to add to your list, I think there has been engagement with Japan and with President Abe, quite a bit by President Trump. So looking at some of those regional dynamics are happening. But clearly the emphasis for the day thus far has been North Korea and China as far as trade.
Except I would say on Japan, despite President Trump saying that Japan is happy today, I'm not sure if Japan is truly happy about the developments, because I think Japan has every right to be very concerned that the U.S. would make a deal with North Korea that on intercontinental ballistic missile, for example, that deals with our threat to our mainland, but doesn't take care of Japan's interests. So while at least the chemistry with Prime Minister Abe and Trump is good, and there's close dialogue, I do think there are underlying concerns in that relationship too.
That's great. We have maybe 20 minutes, I think, for some questions from the audience. We'll start with this gentleman right here.
Hi, James Kitfield from Atlantic Media. Can you describe to me the status quo and how sustainable it is? And I'm particularly interested in your position in general, because readiness and exercises are like cut flowers. At some point, if you don't go back to them, that what they represented in terms of readiness is going to decline. If we are staying in a sort of no missile test, no nuke test, but also no exercises, is that a sustainable status quo for us?
It is, in my view, it is not. In my view, if we do not have another very robust, high-level, like full or Key Resolve and Ultra Freedom Guardian are at a combined level during next April when it's normally scheduled, that will greatly reduce our capabilities over there. Again, I'd go back to what I said earlier. Yes, we can survive one. I know General Brooks and the ROC chairman are doing things to help make sure that the war planning continues, the defensive war planning continues, that communications is working back and forth. All of that is continually happen. Because you got to remember, on a day-to-day basis, we have a combined command over there that are dealing with day-to-day, looking in North Korea, see what's going on, the defensive posture and all that. So it's not like we're doing nothing. We're not just sitting in the motor pool and drinking soju at night. I mean, there's still a lot that's going on over there from a training readiness perspective. So it's not, we're nowhere near to zero. But the ability to be able to execute our plans at the level that we need to, because of North Korea capabilities, because of North Korea location, because of where Seoul is, because of the number of forces that are up there, you know, all the capabilities, that is extremely complex. And if we don't exercise that several times a year, because as I said earlier, the rotation of forces and all that, that is not sustainable from a military perspective, military defensive perspective.
The back there.
Ben Rimland from the German Marshall Fund. So earlier the panel discussed confidence building measures and how difficult it's been to have the North Korean side, engage in the seemingly mundane task of returning the remains of American soldiers missing in action on the North Korean side. But just over the course of this panel, actually, 38 North broke analysis of satellite imagery of the Sohae satellite launch vehicle testing facility, which per their analysis has been dismantled in the period since July 20th. And as we all know, of course, North Korea's satellite launch vehicle testing has been reported as merely a cover for the development of ever more sophisticated intercontinental ballistic missiles. And I was wondering what the panel's reaction might be to the news that the North Korean side is potentially dismantling a site of considerable technical importance. Thank you.
Well, we haven't seen the news,
Yeah.
but if they truly are dismantling that site, then that's a good thing. They've got other sites and a lot more things that need to be dismantled and all, but if that site is being truly dismantled, that's obviously a good thing from my perspective.
I have to read the report, and I'm kind of suspicious of the importance of it if they are actually doing something. There are also other report that you know came out a couple weeks ago. That talked about how North Korea has been aggressively working on the nuclear missile program, even after the summit, citing some 12 intelligence officers, which was a shock to me because usually leak comes from policy, not intelligence community. So I'll have to see, but I feel like if they're making any real concessions, it will appear to be a concession, but not a real concession. So I have to see what side exactly, how much they're working on it, but I'm skeptical right now is some big deal that they are doing right now, having not read the report.
It may not be big, I completely accept that point of view. But at least forward movement to trigger further levels of dialogue could be positive. But there's no way we should be suggesting that this is some kind of step change in North Korea's approach. I mean, I haven't read the report either, of course. But.
And even if they are, we just talked about North Korea's game plan. I just talked about how if he made that decision to come to Onga in September and want to look like he's moving forward, he has to give some concession, whether it's that or another side. So I think it's part of that strategy, and I don't see any indication that it's different from that. They do have to make concessions of some sort, otherwise it can't just continue. Otherwise, there is no second summit with Trump. I mean, even President Trump, I think, will be hard. Even if he wants to, you have to still get some sort of give from North Korea, right?
Yeah, and I'll caveat what I said a minute ago. It's a good thing that they have, if they are truly doing that, but it could be a bad thing from the perspective that here's another thing that we can point to. Look, they are doing something. We're moving in the right direction without, as the previous panel talked about, what's the declaration? What are we really talking about, and what are the steps? If he's doing it in order to be able to gain another 6 months of things are going good, or more discussion within the UN Security Council of, well, look what he did, let's take these sanctions off, and that starts down that lane, then in the bigger picture, it's a very bad thing.
More questions? Yes.
Mike Macetic, PBS Online NewsHour. How much running room does Moon have, particularly if we're sort of in a semi-freeze where not much is really happening? Does he benefit particularly by the fact that the conservative opposition is in a total shambles? At what point does he start feeling other domestic pressures?
Take that.
Yeah.
Moon is under some domestic pressure. There is a constituency there that supports him, partly because they think there are going to be opportunities for economic engagement with North Korea. But as you rightly pointed out, the opposition is in a shambles, so electorally it's an open question whether there's anyone who can actually challenge him. The main opposition party has 10% support. Moon's favorability rating is at 75%, even now. Maybe 69, but that's still really rather high. So he's not under much threat, politically speaking. And if, hypothetically, in spite of all the preparation for economic engagement, that turns out not to be possible, the cynic in me says he can also blame North Korea and the United States for that, so he won't necessarily suffer at the ballot box. So I think his position is okay for the time being. There is a concern in the Moon administration that sometime in the next year or so, his opinion poll ratings will start to decline rapidly, particularly if his other economic policies don't bear fruit. But that remains to be seen. And at the moment, I think he's doing fine.
At the moment, he's doing fine. There are a couple issues that's bubbling, like he raised the minimum wage. That's creating some controversy. There's some refugee crisis that's going on in Jeju Island. But on North Korea, there's a broad public support. Yeah. The issue is if the United States, is not making progress with North Korea, even if he wants to really move forward, let's say open Kaesong Industrial Complex or something like that, it's still a problem on the United Nations Security Council sanctions. It's a sanctions violation. So Moon desperately needs for the US to continue to make progress with North Korea. Otherwise, he would hit that wall. I mean, you can't just, maybe a little bit here and there, but he can't really make progress until US North Korea.
So he has an incentive to take minor concessions from the North to the United States as significant concessions, and then try and use those as justification for getting a little bit of easing off on the sanctions to allow him to do some of the things he wants to do. That's a pretty bad dynamic.
But I think that is the dynamic.
I think it is the dynamic, but I don't think it's a positive one. Any more? Yes, in the back.
So I'm Dong Chang from the Georgetown University. My question is about the view on the denuclearization of Korean Peninsula or North Korea, because I can see from the news media in South Korea misusing the terminology of denuclearization, because some news media may use a denuclearization on the Korean Peninsula, but at the same time some news media may use the North Korean denuclearization. But I believe the denuclearization of North Korea and the denuclearization on Korean Peninsula is totally different. Because denuclearization in the Korean Peninsula also require any strategic weapon of the United States should not be present in South Korea, like a B-2 bombers or carrier strike group, nuclear-powered aircraft carriers. So, because the United States and North Korea is currently in the middle of negotiation, and the negotiation is more like a bargaining process. So if we pursue the North Korean denuclearization, North Korea might pursue the denuclearization on the Korean Peninsula. And this might be beneficial for China too, because the B-2 bomber and the aircraft carrier is really maybe a threat to North Korea or China, because it was really effective whenever North Korea conducted provocation on the Korean Peninsula, or like a nuclear test. We show off, and we responded by showing off our capability of projecting the nuclear power capability. So my question is, if we go the denuclearization on Korean Peninsula by agreeing maybe the terms of North Korea, what kind of problem we might face, or how can we narrow the discrepancies on the views between the United States and North Korea on the denuclearization terminologies? Thank you.
Yeah, I think the denuclearization of the peninsula that Kim Jong-un truly desires goes well beyond just not having B-2s come and do exercises every once in a while, or a carrier battle group in the Yellow Sea. It is splitting the alliance, stopping what we have promised through extended deterrence to be prepared to deal with any North Korea nuclear threat, and splitting the alliance and getting us out of there. And I think that's what the ultimate goal is when he says denuclearize the peninsula, which is obviously hugely dangerous for us, not only there, but for other alliances around the world that we have too, and other places that we are committed to help secure and maintain security there. I hope we don't go down that lane. I don't think we will, but I agree with you. Back to the earlier panel, what is the definition that we're trying to declare of where we're trying to go, I think is a critical aspect of it. And these differences, I actually think they're more known than they're not known, but nobody's willing to sit down and say, no, here's where we're really headed towards.
So in the Singapore Declaration, when you look at the order, right?
Yeah.
They talked about peace regime before working towards the denuclearization of the North Korean peninsula. So I think they are going to continually press for that. Well, we need regime security. We need peace regime. We need peace treaty. And of course, even if the peace treaty does not legally require for us to pull out U.S. troops, what happens after, North Korea does not have to insist on troop reduction or troop pullout from South Korea. Once you conclude a peace treaty, due in time, that question is going to come up because that's why we keep saying it might undermine the rationale of U.S. troop presence in South Korea because it will come up. We don't have a threat. North Korea is no longer a threat, or we have now a peace treaty. What is the need for U.S. troop presence in South Korea? So that's what they're pressing for before denuclearization, and obviously we're pressing for, well, you got to do all of this stuff. You got to give us declaration, you got to give us timetable, you got to give a roadmap, you got to dismantle before we can conclude a peace treaty. So I think that is exactly, as you point out, that's the hurdle. That's where we are.
And one more question, anyone? Yes.
Hi, Hongbo with ICAS. So I have two questions. The first question is, what do you guys see for denuclearization? Like, what do you see the roles for regional players to play for the future denuclearization? And the second question is, I know you guys mentioned about trade war. I just want to maybe get some idea from you guys. Because of the trade war, there are scholars arguing that for trade war, China could use North Korea as a bargaining chip or as an advantage to kind of leverage on the dealing with the U.S. But then there's also arguments saying because of the distrust between Kim and Xi, if China plays the North Korea card during the trade war, it might first not working, or it might backfire to China. What's your opinion on that? Thank you.
Take a stab at either of those.
I'll take a stab at the first one. The importance of the regional players is to maintain as strong as you can, pressure on North Korea to do what North Korea said, to denuclearize and to maintain the sanctions. Japan's doing that, South Korea's doing that. I worry about China, I worry about Russia, because I think they are not putting as much pressure as they could on with the sanctions. So I think that from a military perspective, I think it is important that we continue to work very strong in planning and exercises to keep a military alliance strong, not only South Korea and the United States, but also to increase the trilateral military planning and the limited exercises we have with Japan also, because I think that puts pressure on North Korea, and it definitely increases our readiness over there. So, keeping the alliance strong, I think, is probably one of the most important things that we do that puts a lot of pressure on North Korea from a military perspective. And I won't get into the trade war stuff.
You mentioned the idea of using North Korea as a bargaining chip in the trade war question on China's side. That's just one example of how one of the two Koreas gets used as a point of leverage in a greater power struggle in East Asia. And I can't foresee a situation in which that stops being the case anytime soon. So that's just one example you gave, but I can think of plenty more where North Korea continues to be a point of leverage for China, and South Korea to an extent is a point of leverage for the United States as well.
Great. Terrific. Well, thank you all for a great panel discussion. I think what we've come to here, just a final takeaway, was that we now have something set up for the UN General Assembly with Chris saying that Kim will not be there. I think Sumi was sort of in the middle, likely possible. And General Sharp said, not only will he come, but we'll meet with President Trump with the end to a buddy movie there, or maybe round two.
I didn't say that.
I added that little part. I added the second part of that. Well, thank you all very much again, and thanks to our distinguished panel. Really appreciate it. Thank you to CSIS and for all of your great questions. Appreciate it.